she filed it. There was an afternoon in the 5th week when Nikolai arrived with a professional drafting set for Dash. Not a children's kit, actual tools, the kind Aurora used herself for spatial work. Dash opened the box with the expression he reserved for things that had weight, and was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Thank you." Nikolai said, "You're welcome." The exchange had a compression to it that Aurora turned away from in the kitchen doorway because it was too specific to look at directly. There was an afternoon in the 7th week when Elodie climbed into Nikolai's lap during a card game without preamble and announced that she had thought about it, and he could be her dad now if he wanted. He went completely still for 3 seconds. Then he put his arms around her and said, "I want that very much." Elodie said, "Good, then it's decided," and went back to the game as though the matter was closed, because for Elodie it was. Dash took longer. He always took longer. He was the kind of person who needed to be certain before he committed, who tested structural integrity quietly and at length before trusting his weight to something. Aurora recognized it because she had the same quality, and she understood it wasn't coldness but carefulness. The specific carefulness of a person who knows that some things, once broken, require real evidence of repair before they can bear weight again. The moment with Dash came on a Sunday in the 9th week, while Elodie napped, a rarity, attributed to a birthday party the day before that had run 2 hours over schedule. Just Dash and Nikolai in the living room, Aurora in the kitchen, door open. Dash had his sketchbook. Nikolai had a book from Aurora's shelf, something on structural engineering she'd bought for a project and never finished. They sat in compatible silence for 40 minutes. Then Dash said, "Are you sad about the time you missed?" Nikolai lowered the book, "Yes." Dash drew a careful line. "I'm sad about it too." He didn't look up. I didn't have a word for it before. There was just something that wasn't there, and I didn't know what to call it. Nikolai didn't speak immediately. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he said. "I know that doesn't fix it." Dash looked up. "Mom's sorry too. She thinks we don't know, but we know." He looked back down at the page. "She doesn't have to keep being sorry. We're going to be okay." A pause. We're going to be okay. Then, without any announcement, Dash got up from where he was sitting, walked across the room, and climbed into Nikolai's lap. He settled himself with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a child who has made a decision and is implementing it. He opened his sketchbook. He began drawing. Nikolai went completely still. Then, with the deliberate carefulness of someone handling something fragile they are determined not to break, he put one arm around his son. Aurora stood at the kitchen sink with both hands gripping the counter and breathed through what was happening in her chest with no adequate strategy for managing it. The conversation between her and Nikolai, the one that wasn't about the children, the one about the 4 years and the corridor and the cost of it, happened on a Tuesday evening in the 11th week, after both kids were in bed and the apartment had gone quiet. He had stayed late. Elodie had insisted on finishing a geography quiz she'd invented and administered to everyone present. Aurora had made coffee without deciding to, and they were sitting at the kitchen table, and the silence had been running long enough that what it contained needed to be addressed. "I kept things from you," Nikolai said. He said it like he'd been waiting for the right entrance point, and this was it. "For 10 months. I hid what I actually was because I told myself it was to protect you. But that wasn't all of it." His voice was even. "I was afraid that if you understood the full scope of what I was involved in, you'd leave, and I wasn't ready to risk that. So I managed information instead of trusting you." A pause. "And that management is part of why Greer's setup worked. You couldn't have been staged successfully against something you trusted completely." Aurora looked at him. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "You should have asked me," he said, "before you got on that bus. One call, one question. You should have trusted me enough for that." "I know." "You didn't." "No." She set the mug down. "I didn't. And I told myself it was because of what I'd seen. But underneath that, it was because I had always known there were things you weren't telling me, and the corridor gave me a reason to stop pretending I was fine with not knowing." She stopped. That's not an excuse. It's an explanation. There's a difference, he said. Yes. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Chicago made its late noise. I want to tell you everything, Nikolai said. The firm, the operations, the things that don't appear in any public filing. All of it. He looked at her steadily. Not because you need to know to be in the children's lives, but because I want there to be no version of what I am that you haven't been given the chance to decide about. She understood what the offer contained, what it cost him to construct a proposal that included the option of her refusal. Tell me, she said. He told her, thoroughly, without strategic omission. The construction network with its organized component, the protection arrangements, the things that had been necessary and the things he was not proud of, the men who worked for him and what they were capable of. He said it like a man reading a ledger, without softening the entries, and let her hold the weight of each one herself. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the kitchen had gone cold and the coffee was past temperature. The highest exposure operations, she said. Are they? I started closing them 18 months ago. He met her eyes. Finding out about you, about Dash and Elodie, accelerated it. I want to be present for them in a way that's incompatible with certain obligations. A pause. I can't close everything immediately. There are arrangements that require time to resolve without damaging the people who work them. But the direction is set. Because of them, she said. Because of them, and because of me. He was quiet for a moment. I've been doing this long enough to understand what it costs. I would like, if it's still possible, to find out what the other thing costs. She looked at him across the table. The gray eyes her children had inherited. The face she had spent 4 years trying to make less specific in her memory and had failed. I want to stay in Chicago for another week, she said. I want to see all of it. The businesses, the operations, the people. I want to see it clearly before I decide anything. Something shifted in his expression, not triumph. Something quieter. The look of a man who has been standing somewhere cold for a long time and has just been told, tentatively, that there might be a door. 1 week, he said. She nodded and picked up her phone from the counter and held it without seeing it. Dash told me something, Nikolai said. She looked up. He said you think they don't know you're still sorry. He said to tell you that you don't have to keep being sorry. Nikolai's voice had a quality she'd only heard in it twice before, the unmanaged kind, with no wall around it. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "We're going to be okay." He's 4, Aurora said. Her voice came out thinner than she intended. He's 4, Nikolai said, and he is already carrying other people's weight to spare them from it. He stopped. He got that from you. She looked at the dark window for a moment. He got the gray eyes from you, she said. A pause. Then I suppose that makes us equally responsible for him. Something loosened in her chest. Not all the way, not in one movement, but something. I suppose it does, she said. She turned off the kitchen light. In the dark, the city outside the window kept its permanent motion, entirely indifferent to the specific weight of 2 people to kitchen in Chicago, trying to build something from the wreckage of a decision made on a bus 4 years ago, with the only materials available to them, honesty and time, and 2 4-year-olds with gray eyes who had already, in their particular ways, made the decision for them. Same park Sunday, she said. Same park, he said, same time. She nodded. He gathered his jacket and she walked him to the door, and they stood in the doorway for a moment, the way people stand when the thing that needs saying hasn't found its language yet, and both of them know it, and neither of them forces it. Good night, Nikolai. Good night, Aurora. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway with her hand on the handle and listened to his footsteps descend the stairs. She thought, this is not fixed, and it may not fix, and there is no version of the next year that is going to be simple. And underneath that, quieter, but it is not what it was last month. And underneath that, quieter still, and last month was not what it was 4 years ago. She pushed off the door and went to check on her children one last time. Dash was asleep with one hand open against the mattress, palm up, the way he always slept. Elodie had her wrist brace propped on a pillow, one foot hanging entirely off the edge of the mattress at an angle that suggested she had been arguing with the covers, and the covers had won. Aurora adjusted the ice pack. She stood in the doorway between their rooms and looked at the two small faces in the dark and thought about gray eyes and top-shelf anatomy books and the specific ordinary miracle of two people who had been produced, in all the wreckage and distance and error, and who were somehow already braver than either of their parents had managed to be. She went to bed, and for the first time in a long time, she stopped rehearsing the next thing she would have to manage, and let herself, carefully, like someone learning to trust a floor that has given way before, begin to believe that the moving might finally be over. The months after that had their own texture, layered, the way years are when more than one thing is happening at once. Nikolai came to Chicago every second weekend, and the Sunday mornings in the park extended naturally into Sunday afternoons, and then into Sunday dinners at Aurora's apartment, where he cooked with gradually improving results. The pasta was his most reliable offering. Dash developed an interest in the technical side of cooking that turned the kitchen into a quiet collaboration between father and son, involving significant discussion about heat and timing. Elodie found this incomprehensible and said so. Nikolai listened to her objections with the same seriousness he brought to her geography quizzes, which she received as her due. Elodie won her first chess game against him in the 4th month. He told her he hadn't let her win. She told him she knew. She'd been tracking his patterns for 6 weeks. He looked at Aurora over Elodie's head with the expression of a man recalibrating. Aurora's work in Chicago expanded. She took on a consulting partnership with a roastery in the West Loop, which gave her reason to stay longer between visits and then reason to stay. The apartment above hers opened up in March, and her landlord offered it before listing it. She stood at the window of the empty unit on a Tuesday morning looking at the skyline and thought about the bulletin board in Portland where she'd found Norma's sublet, the bus ticket, the $400 in cash. And she thought about Dash sliding the orange juice toward Elodie's good hand without looking up. She signed the lease that afternoon. Norma flew out for the move. She was 76 now and had opinions about the placement of the furniture and the organization of the kitchen cabinets and the particular quality of Chicago's light, which she found acceptable. She attended both twins' birthday parties and Dash's first school art show and the opening of the roastery's new retail space, for which Aurora had done the sourcing and the menu concept. She sat in the front row at each of these events with the bearing of someone who had decided some time ago that front rows were where she belonged. The conversation between Aurora and Nikolai, the one that wasn't about logistics or the children or the week ahead, the real one, the one about what the last 4 years had cost them both, and whether anything could exist on the other side, happened over many evenings rather than in one. That was appropriate. They were two people who had learned at some cost that the large, dramatic decisions were the ones most likely to be made badly. It happened in the accumulated weight of ordinary time. In the evenings after the kids were down, when they sat at the kitchen table and talked about his work and the direction it was moving, about her sourcing trips and the foundation concept she was developing for specialty coffee education in under-resourced communities, about the city outside the window and the years that had passed in it. They talked the way they had talked in those early months at Kindling. Two minds moving in compatible directions without requiring translation. She had wondered, in the abstract, whether that quality between them was a product of the 10 specific months they'd had, something that wouldn't survive the damage. Sitting across from him at 11 o'clock in her kitchen in Chicago, she understood it wasn't a product of those months. It had been there in the first 45 seconds, across a coffee bar, in the particular quality of his attention. She went to New York with him in April, one weekend, to see the East Coast operations she hadn't yet seen, to meet the people who had been part of his world throughout the years he'd been looking for her. She left the kids with Vanessa, that had been its own separate conversation, over coffee in a neutral location, measured and honest and difficult in the specific way that honest conversations are difficult after a long silence. She would not say it had healed everything. It hadn't. But the fracture had been properly acknowledged, which was the necessary first step. She came home from New York on a Sunday evening and walked into her apartment and found Dash at the kitchen table with his sketchbook and Elodie reorganizing the bookshelf by a system she was willing to explain to anyone who asked. And she stood in the doorway and thought, I have to stop letting fear make my decisions. She had thought it before. This time it settled somewhere lower, more structural. Nikolai asked her to marry him on a Wednesday morning in October at the kitchen table in the specific ordinary light that came through the window at that hour. The kids were at school. He was on his second coffee. She was on her first. He said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that however you answer, nothing I've said about Dash and Elodie or the arrangements between us changes. She looked at him. I want to marry you, he said. I want to stop driving 20 minutes home at the end of the evening. I want Dash and Elodie to have parents who are in the same apartment. I want to call this what it is and stop the provisional version of it. He paused. I know that's a large ask. I know the last time we had a large change in our arrangement, it took significant time to arrive at. It took significant time, she said, not necessarily this time. He looked at her. I've been thinking about it since July, she said. I didn't want to raise it before you did. I didn't want you to feel like I was deciding the shape of your life. She held his gaze. But yes, the apartment and the not provisional and stopping the 20-minute drive. She paused. Yes. He said nothing for a moment. Yes, he said. Yes, she said. He stood up from the table. She stayed at the counter. He crossed the kitchen, not 12 steps this time, just 4. The kitchen was smaller than a conference lobby, and stopped in front of her and put both hands on her face, the way she had once put her hands over Norma's, and looked at her with the full weight of 11 years of whatever the specific thing between them was. No more hidden things, he said. No more running, she said. He kissed her, not like a beginning, not like a reunion, like something that had been in the right place for a long time and had simply, finally, arrived at the room where it was supposed to be. They married the following spring at a small venue on the North Shore on a Saturday in April, when the trees along the lake were doing the thing they do in the Midwest in April, that brief, specific extravagance before everything settles into ordinary green. No press, no guest list designed to signal anything. 40 people who mattered, and a ceremony that said the true things without excess. Norma sat in the front row, which was where she belonged. Dash and Elodie walked Aurora down the aisle. Dash in a dark suit he had chosen himself, moving with the contained gravity he brought to everything that mattered. Elodie in a dress she had negotiated extensively over and accepted with the air of someone who had made strategic concessions in exchange for undisclosed future victories, moving with the straight-backed authority she brought to everything, always. Nikolai stood at the end of the aisle and watched his family walk toward him and did not try to manage his expression at all. Aurora saw his face from 20 feet away and thought about a coffee bar 3 years ago and a cortado made without asking, and the first 45 seconds of knowing him, and she thought, this is the end of the distance. The ceremony said what it needed to say. The rings were plain and specific. The words were theirs. Afterward, Heath stood at the edge of the gathering with a glass of champagne and the expression of a man who had spent 12 years in Nikolai's orbit and was now at a wedding in April with a feeling he didn't have immediate language for. Elodie appeared beside him. She looked up with the gray eyes that had been making him think of someone since the moment he'd first seen her. "Are you happy?" she said, with the directness she brought to everything. Heath looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. Elodie nodded, as though confirming something she'd expected. "Good," she said. "You should be," and walked away with the authority of someone who has delivered a verdict and moved on. Heath stood alone for a moment, Then, quietly, without observation, he smiled. The years after had a texture that the years before hadn't, layered, with multiple registers happening at once. The work of building something from materials that had been damaged required the full human capacity for holding contradictory things. There were hard weeks when the remaining operations produced complications that came home with Nikolai in the set of his jaw and the quality of his silence. Aurora had learned to read those weeks and not make them simpler than they were. There were months when the old gravity attempted to reassert itself through obligations that hadn't yet been fully closed. He handled them with the methodical thoroughness he brought to everything he had decided to finish, and he came home afterward and talked about it, because they had decided early that talking was better than the alternative. There were hard things with the children, too. Elodie at 7 had a period of sustained fury at Aurora. Not articulated, not directed, just present in the shortened sentences and the slammed doors and the particular quality of a child processing something too large for her years. Aurora sat with it and did not make it simpler and did not tell her to stop, because she understood what it was made of. Dash at 8 asked Nikolai directly, on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table while Elodie was still asleep, what exactly he had been involved in before when he was running the full operation. Nikolai looked at his son for a long moment and told him the honest shape of it, not the full technical detail, but the truth. What it was, why it had been, what it had cost. Dash listened with the focused attention he brought to structural information. Then he said, "And you stopped." Not a question. "Yes," Nikolai said. Dash nodded. "Okay," he said, and went back to his drawing. There were ordinary things, too, the ones that accumulated into the texture of a life, shared rather than lived in separate rooms. Dinners that ran past the time anyone had intended because the conversation was better than sleep. Sunday mornings with the light coming through the kitchen windows the specific way it came through in Chicago. That quality she'd noticed when she was 23 and looking for a lease and had factored it into her decision. Dash at the kitchen table with his sketchbook. Elodie reading something dense and argumentative with penciled annotations in the margins. Nikolai with a coffee going cold because something was happening in the room that interested him more. Aurora's foundation work grew. It grew past the initial concept into a partnership with 3 specialty roasters and a nonprofit education organization, training young people from under-resourced communities in the full supply chain of coffee, from sourcing to service. It was the best professional work she had ever done, better than the consulting, better than any single project, because it was the work she had dreamed about before any of it, before the corridor, before the bus, before the years of managing alone. The work she had described to Nikolai on their second meeting, at a bar 2 blocks from Kindling, on a night she'd stayed past closing to fix a portafilter, when she had said what she wanted to build and he had listened with the full weight of his attention. He remembered. He had built the infrastructure for it while he was looking for her. She thought about that sometimes, not with the uncomplicated gratitude that would have been easier, with the complicated kind, which was more honest. The understanding that grief, held in the hands of the right person, sometimes becomes something else entirely. 3 years after the wedding, on an October evening in Chicago, Aurora and Nikolai stood on the balcony of their apartment with the city laid out below them, lit and moving and entirely indifferent to anniversaries, to the specific weight of an evening that holds more than one ordinary evening could reasonably be asked to hold. Inside, Dash and Elodie were making noise that suggested an argument about something that would be resolved within 10 minutes and forgotten within 20, because that was how they argued, specifically, thoroughly, and without lasting damage. Aurora had her arms on the railing. Nikolai was beside her. They'd been standing in silence for a while, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but has things moving through it quietly. "I still think about them," she said. "The 4 years." He said nothing. "Not the same shape as before, but I think about them." She looked at the city. "The things I missed, the things you missed, the things I chose when I got on that bus." "Yes," he said. I don't know that there's a version of it I make peace with completely, she said. I think it's just one of the things I carry. A pause, but it's lighter than it was. He put one hand on the railing beside hers, not covering it, just beside it, the same way he'd stood beside her at a window 4 years ago, giving her the space she needed in the only way available to him. When I was looking for you, he said, the thing that kept me going wasn't hope exactly. It was the specific refusal to accept that what existed between us had been permanently interrupted by a sequence of events that should never have had the power to interrupt it. He paused. It felt like an error, not a tragedy. An error, an administrative failure in the sequence of things that was fixable if I could locate the right point in the system. She looked at him, and when you found me. The error was more complicated than I'd planned for. A pause, but still fixable. She looked at the city, at the density of light that was Chicago from above, that impossible accumulation of lit windows, each containing a life, a history, a set of decisions that had seemed enormous and turned out to be ordinary in the scale of things. Inside, the argument resolved. They could hear the specific cadence of Elodie conceding a point she had been maintaining past its useful life, stating the correct position as though she'd always held it, and Dash accepting this without comment, which he'd learned to do because it was more efficient than noting the inconsistency. Nikolai listened. Something moved in his face. The quality of attention he brought to the sounds of his children, which had never in 3 years of daily life become ordinary to him. Dash's show opens next Thursday, she said. I know, he's been calibrating for a week. That's what anxiety looks like on him. That's what concentration looks like on me. I know, she said. I said what I said. He looked at her. That thing in his expression that had no adequate name, the specific look of a man who has spent years finding the same person surprising and has arrived at a place where the surprise is no longer surprising and is simply one of the permanent features of his world. No more hidden things, he said. What he'd said in the kitchen on the morning of the proposal, what they'd said to each other in the ceremony. Not a vow exactly, something more functional than a vow. Something that required regular maintenance rather than a single declaration. No more running, she said. He turned to her. On the balcony of their apartment in the city, where everything had started and ended and started again, he put his arms around her the way you hold something you have spent years learning the value of. She leaned into him, not like falling, like arriving. Behind them, the sounds of the apartment moved through the rooms with the ease of things that belonged where they were. 2 children who had grown up inside this particular life and were still, in their particular ways, growing. The city kept its noise below them, indifferent and brilliant, the way it always had and always would. The city where a woman had made good coffee and a man had come back for it on a Friday, and the first 45 seconds of knowing each other had set something in motion that 4 years of distance and error and sustained grief had not been able to stop. Some things cannot be recovered. Some time cannot be returned. Some choices leave a mark that stays visible regardless of everything that comes after. But the rest of their life was theirs, and they had learned finally the only thing that had ever actually mattered, that staying when everything in you is organized around leaving is not weakness. It is not surrender. It is not the loss of yourself. It is the bravest thing you will ever do. The city glowed beneath them. Inside, Dash and Elodie were laughing about something. Nikolai closed his eyes and listened. And Aurora, with her face against his shoulder and the cold October air on her cheeks and the long years behind them and the open one ahead, let herself feel, without managing it, without reducing it into something more portable, what it meant to have stopped running. It meant this, exactly this.